Hi everybody and welcome back to Murder of Bedtime with me, your host Lyndon. If you listen to this podcast regularly, you know that I think you are all awesome, and if this is your first time, I hope I can persuade you to stay and return next time. This is a 15 to 20 minute true crime bedtime story. No frills, no waffle, no adverts, no sponsors, no need to buy me a coffee. If there is any waffle, you will find it all at the end of the story, where you can just switch me off or listen on for me spouting some gobbledygook. And with that, let's crack on with today's episode called Death in the Attic. Now, it would be true to say Maggie was feeling a bit worse for wear as she and her friend and lodger Mary made their way home to number 4 Gildart Street after a few too many bevies at the local pub. Mary unlocked and opened the door for her landlady and saw her to her favourite chair, and then declared that she was going back out for a bit, and she left. In the quiet, dimly lit room, Maggie started to nod off, when suddenly her eyes snapped open, alerted by a noise coming from upstairs. She knew the lodgers were out, and her son was working in the shop at the front of the house, so the movement must be coming from the attic, and that just wasn't allowed. She slowly rose from her chair and climbed the 2 sets of stairs to the attic room. When she reached a solid wooden door with a huge chain threaded through hasps and padlocked shut, she removed a key from a pocket in her petticoat, unlocked the padlock and slid the chain through its hasps, and wrapping one end of the heavy chain around her hand while letting the other end drag along the floor, she opened the door and entered the dark, putrid-smelling room. In the shadows she could make out the form of a man, naked except for a pair of trousers pulled halfway up his legs. He shrank back away from the woman. "Oh," she exclaimed, "you've found yourself some clothes, have you? Happen you was planning on getting out on a night on the town. Or maybe you was planning on stealing some more tea and sugar from my shop and taking it to your fancy woman down on Oak Street." "No, Maggie, honest, I weren't," while shaking his head frantically, came the frightened reply. But it fell on deaf ears, as at that very moment John Walber's wife drew back her arm and hit him a heavy blow on the top of the head with all the strength she could muster with the heavy chain. And she continued to beat him relentlessly. When the chain became too heavy, she let it fall to the floor and picked up a nearby porcelain chamber pot and renewed the attack until it smashed. She then continued to beat him with the jagged edges of the broken pot, gouging and slicing his head and face into a bloody mass, until all that was left was the handle of the pot, which she tossed away, and resumed the beating again with the chain. The attack only coming to an end when her son came hurtling into the room, shouting, "Enough, mother, that's enough!" As he stared down at the body of his clearly dead stepfather, and then surveyed the scene, the room was blood-soaked. It was on the walls, ceiling and floor, the mattress, and all over his mother. So how did John Walber come to be locked into an attic bedroom at 4 Gildart Street in the heart of Liverpool by his wife? And why now had she brutally beaten him to death? This is the story as we know it. 48-year-old Margaret Murray married 50-year-old John Walber in 1889, a second marriage for both of them. Margaret had a son, also called John, from her first marriage, who mostly lived in Ireland, where he was a travelling musician, but did travel at times to Liverpool to stay with his mother and stepfather, and helped out in the convenience store she ran from a ground floor room of their 3-storey house. John Murray would share a bedroom with his stepfather when he was there, as John Walber had been suspected of cheating on his wife, and she had moved herself and her bed to a room downstairs in the shop. The middle floor of the house was taken up by the Walbers' lodgers, Mary Vouse and her boyfriend James Pearson. After 4 years of marriage, whatever the attraction had been between man and wife when they married had definitely now worn off. They were both big drinkers, and whereas John was said to be quiet and non-abusive, even when drunk, Margaret had a volatile, violent temper, mixed with a hot streak of jealousy, not helped in the slightest by John's unfaithfulness. 17 years earlier, before he became entwined with Margaret, he had a relationship with a lady called Annie Connolly. For some reason it ended, and they both went their separate ways. But John always held a candle for Annie, and when she moved into a house just a stone's throw from Gildart Street in Oak Street, it was only a matter of time before the two bumped into each other again. Now, in some of my research, it is said that John Walber had known Annie Connolly for 30 years, and she was in fact a sex worker who kept a brothel. Now, I couldn't confirm this, however, but we do know that John Walber had been married before to an American lady who he lived with in America, but he had abandoned her and returned to England, which begs the question, did he actually divorce his first wife, and was he in fact legally married to Maggie? Anyway, Maggie had her suspicions about Annie, even though John vehemently denied visiting her, and many rows were overheard over the subject of his visits to Oak Street by the son and the lodgers. On the 2nd of May 1893, John Walber announced he was going out for a walk, but this time Maggie decided to follow him, watching from a safe distance as he entered the house on Oak Street and giving him just enough time to get snuggled down in his favourite armchair. She crossed the road and banged loudly on the door. When Annie opened it, she barged straight past her. "Take him," Annie shouted at Maggie. "I don't want to." Maggie, finding her target, lunged at her husband, throwing him to the floor, then kicking him viciously. She then took any money he had on him and snarled in his face, "Stay here. I don't want you neither." How long he stayed out isn't known, but when he returned home the argument continued until sometime that night, totally drunk, John lapsed into unconsciousness. Whereupon Maggie fetched her son to help her get John up the stairs to the attic, stripped him of his clothes, and chained the door of the room locked. A lot of reports of the crime at the time reported that John was chained naked to the wall of the room. I don't believe this, as his sister did visit him in the 4 months he was kept prisoner, and I think she may have had something to say about that, if indeed Maggie would have even allowed her to see her brother in that state. In the 4 months he was imprisoned, not one person reported to the police that they had heard him being beaten and shouting out "murder" at the top of his voice. They just chose to ignore it. Indeed, when his sister did come to visit him, she must have noticed the chain on the door. She said later that he looked ill and drugged with something. She told Maggie that a doctor or a priest should be called, but Maggie replied there was no need for that. And for some reason, the sister went happily on her way the next morning after breakfast. On Thursday, the 16th of November, around midday, Maggie sent out for whisky, which she shared with her son and her lodgers, Mary Vouse and James Pearson, where she had a conversation about having fly papers in the shop and how she would like to use them on her husband. Now, I think most people know that flypapers contained arsenic, which could be removed from the papers by soaking in a dish of water, a great way of poisoning in that era. At some time early afternoon, Maggie and Mary Vowles left the house and went into town, where Maggie withdrew some money from her post office account, and the two ladies went to a pub on Bayhorse Lane, where they bumped into a fellow neighbour in the pub who also lived on Gildart Street and used the Walber's shop, called Emma Mottram. She would say that on this particular day, Maggie Walber was acting much more excited than normal and had called a man they knew, John Sullivan, a labourer, to join them at their table. She bought the four of them drinks before asking if any of them would like to go round to Annie Connolly's house, smash her windows and give her a good hiding for a sovereign in payment. She also said she would mutilate her husband right up to the navel before any other woman should enjoy him. Presumably neither Mrs. Mottram or Mr. Sullivan thought much of this idea and left shortly after. It was later, after this meeting, that Mary led Maggie home and the attack on John Walber took place. Maggie's son, John Murray, had been working in the shop and heard a noise. Going to investigate, as we now know, he went up to the attic room where he had found his mother standing over the bloody mess that had been his stepfather. He decided to get out fast. He spent the night in the basement and the next morning he headed back to Ireland. It wasn't until 10:30 the following morning that James Pearson informed the police about John Walber's death. After Margaret Walber had walked into their room and informed them that her son John had killed her husband, took money from her purse, packed up his instruments and left. When the police arrived, Maggie was calmly working in the shop when they passed her on the way up to the attic. After surveying the scene and taking away evidence and taking statements from the lodgers, Maggie was taken into custody, where she changed her story and admitted it was her alone that committed the murder and in fact had given her son John the money to take flight. Margaret Walber was sent to trial at St George's Hall, Liverpool, on the 14th of March 1894 before Judge Mr Justice Day. Evidence was given against Margaret by James Pearson, Mary Vowles, Anne Connolly, Emma Mottram and John Sullivan, and for the first time a forensic blood spattering evidence was used regarding the blood on Margaret's clothes and boots. The trial took only one day, the jury finding her guilty and the judge sentencing her to death, declaring that he found it most surprising that what she did was possible in the middle of Liverpool. Margaret Walber was hanged at Walton Gaol on the morning of the 2nd of April 1893 by James Billington. Well, I hope you found that tale interesting. All I can say is I can't believe that all those people who must have known something was going on in that attic bedroom for 4 months and said nothing, and then fancy trying to pin the murder on your own son. Anyway, that's the end of the story, so now you can switch me off, or if you are a murder at bedtime masochist, you can listen on to my waffle. Now, I hope you all had a nice Halloween. It bucketed down with rain here, so not many trick-or-treaters out this year. But I did manage to get out and film a Halloween special episode on the legend of Jasper Jackson for my YouTube channel, The Exiled Yellowbelly. So check that out if you fancy it. And I've got a nice little TikTok out at the moment on the subject of death by soaring. Last week I went to the Grove Theatre in Dunstable to see a talk by former Home Office pathologist Dr. Richard Shepherd. Now this was amazing. Dr. Shepherd was involved in such cases and disasters as the Hungerford Massacre, Rachel Nickell, 7/11, the Bali bombings and the Marchioness disaster. His book, Unnatural Causes, is a bestseller, and I've read it twice. Before the show, I went to the Gary Cooper Wetherspoons in Dunstable and found out that Gary Cooper of High Noon fame actually went to school in Dunstable for 4 years. I also popped over to the local church and did a story on Sally the Dunstable Witch, so a very productive visit. I can safely say I like Dunstable. I'd like to thank some of the sources for this story, and top of this list must go to Alan Hayhurst, author of the brilliant More Lancashire Murders. I had completely written out my research on this story when I came across Mr. Hayhurst's book. I bought it, and when it arrived, it had so much new information I had to completely rewrite it. The reason being, Mr. Hayhurst realised that the files on the Walber murder file had been filed under Walker at the National Archives. So basically, he was the first person to find out all the details. Absolutely genius, if you ask me. And I hope you are not offended with me using parts of your story. I got his book from Abe Books, but More Lancashire Murders and his first book, Lancashire Murders, plus many more, are available on Amazon. Also, thank you to the other main sources to this story: www.capitalpunishmentuk.org, www.britishexecutions.co.uk, www.oldmerseytimes.co.uk, the Liverpool Echo, the book Hanged at Liverpool by Steve Fielding, and the book Foul Deeds and Suspicious Deaths in Liverpool by Stephen Wade. Also, thank you as always to Jonathan Seeger for the continued use of Cursed Lullaby for my intro on my podcast, and thank you for listening. Please feel free to drop me a line on Instagram, and please rate and review with whatever you think the podcast deserves. And with that, it's time for me to shut up and hopefully see you next time. So sleep well.